Welcome to Plato's Cave for our December 21, 2014 broadcast. My name is Doris Motormouth and I am your Poseidon news anchor. China local debt crisis spells global opportunity in 2015. Bloomberg. China's overhaul of local government financing spells opportunity for global investors in 2015. Standard & Poor's and Moody's Investors Service predict municipalities facing severe financing needs may follow the lead of Beijing's subway builder in selling debt overseas to cut costs. Beijing Infrastructure Investment Company became China's first metro provider to sell global bonds this year, raising $1.3 billion, including a $1 billion offering in November. Yields on local government financing vehicle notes surged this month and the market was thrown into disarray after regional authorities pulled their support for two borrowing arms, raising the risk of defaults. LGFVs, facing 558.7 billion yuan, $90 billion, of maturing debt next year, were able to raise 67.7 billion yuan selling bonds in December, the least in 11 months. The evolving status of LGFVs will definitely produce more dollar bonds, especially for the stronger names, as certain LGFVs morph into state-owned enterprises or even financing vehicles akin to Beijing infrastructure, said Raymond Chia, the Singapore-based head of credit research for Asia ex-Japan at Schroeder Investment Management Limited, which had $447.7 billion under management as of September 30. The fundamental aspects of the company need to be valued as opposed to just looking at the government support. Yield premium. Beijing Infrastructure raised $1 billion selling 3.25% notes due 2020 and 2.625% 2017 notes on November 13. According to Bloomberg compiled data, the metro operator's $300 million of 2019 debentures were trading at 189 basis points more than similar maturity treasuries on December 19 versus an issue spread of 210 basis points when they were sold in March, prices on Bloomberg show. Yield premiums on dollar bonds for Chinese companies have narrowed 24 basis points in the same period to 348.3 basis points on December 18, according to JP Morgan Chase & Company indexes. The extra yield over sovereign debt for one-year corporate notes rated AA, the most common ranking for LGFVs, instead of sovereign debt has risen 94 basis points this month to 250 basis points, the widest since June, China bond data show. Spreads on 7-year AA-rated local debt are up 63 basis points to 2.72 percentage points as of December 18. Questions about the future of LGFVs began in October when Premier Li Keqiang queried the implicit guarantees on the companies, set up to fund infrastructure projects after a 1994 budget law banned regional authorities from directly issuing bonds. The State Council said October 2 that the finance arms can no longer raise funds for local authorities, and that the governments have no obligation to repay debt that wasn't raised to fund public projects. Sales scrap. The Finance Ministry has also asked local authorities to detail all outstanding borrowings by January 5 as it extends a municipal bond market trial. Shandong last week became the first province to outline implementation of the campaign to curb regional debt, which swelled to 17.9 trillion yuan as of June 2013, according to a national audit. Changsha Xiaoning Construction Development Company, based in the eastern province of Jiangsu, announced December 12 that wouldn't go ahead with a planned 1.2 billion yuan sale just one day after authorities said they wouldn't support its debt. Less than a week later, officials withdrew backing for another planned LGFV issue in the northwestern province of Xinjiang. Now that local governments have stringent balance sheet requirements, many municipalities will have to consider diversifying their income source in order to expand their metro networks, said Gloria Liu, an analyst in Hong Kong at S&P. Overseas funding, at least in the near term, provides cost benefits compared with domestic funding. Dim sum bonds. Beijing Infrastructure, tasked with almost doubling the subway network in 5 years, also sold 1.2 billion yuan of 3-year dim sum bonds at a yield of 3.75% in June. In the onshore market, the company priced 4 billion yuan of one-year notes to yield 5.06% in May. The yuan has declined 2.7% this year against the US dollar. Beijing Infrastructure is rated AAA by China Chengxin International Credit Rating Company and A1 by Moody's, which said it doesn't consider Beijing Infrastructure as an LGFV. The allocations in the budget have been there for many years, said Ivan Chung, a senior vice president at Moody's in Hong Kong. The subway has to be approved by the central government first, meaning there's a legitimate way for them to allocate directly from the budget. Beijing has 200 meters of track for every 10,000 people, compared with 500 meters in New York. According to S&P, there are nearly 40 cities in China that have approval to build a metro by 2020. By that time, the central government targets 6,000 kilometers, 3,728 miles, of metro lines will be built, which S&P estimates will require as much as 2.5 trillion yuan. The success of future bond deals in the sector may hinge on the efforts that every issuer takes to explain the reasons why they are going offshore, said Alan Roche, head of Asia Pacific Bond Syndicate at Royal Bank of Scotland plc in Singapore. Draghi starts squaring QE circle in month of persuasion for ECB. Bloomberg. Mario Draghi has 1 month to win consensus on quantitative easing by showing he won't endanger the European Central Bank. As officials prepare to consider sovereign bond purchases on January 22, the ECB president is working to get as many policymakers and as much of the public on his side as possible. One concession being debated is to require national central banks to be responsible for at least some of their own credit risk, according to people familiar with the talks. Draghi's chief mission in the next 31 days will be to counter arguments that a QE package designed to revive inflation will instead see the ECB loading up with junk assets at high prices to bail out negligent governments. While he might never convince more vocal opponents such as Bundesbank President Jens Wiedmann, he can strengthen his position by crafting a program that addresses the concerns of doubters. In case of sovereign QE, it'll be difficult to square the circle to make everybody happy, said Marco Valli, an economist at UniCredit SPA in Milan. But they are trying to make it as consensual as possible, bringing on board some of the smaller states. It would be important for the credibility of any sovereign QE program to reduce dissent as much as possible. Wiedmann has argued that aside from the question of whether government bond purchases are legal, there's no need for more action now. He has said a slump in oil prices will provide a mini stimulus to the economy. Yet the same slide is proving a concern for Draghi because of the risk that it feeds through into inflation expectations and tips the euro area into a deflationary spiral. Negative inflation. Not to pursue our mandate would be illegal, Draghi said on December 4 after strengthening the Governing Council's official statement to say stimulus is intended to expand the ECB's balance sheet by as much as €1 trillion, $1.2 trillion. In a preview of the disagreements he might face, that change, the Council previously said stimulus was expected to boost the balance sheet, was opposed by a quarter of the 24 policymakers, including half the 6-person executive board. While some of those opponents are still likely to support QE, reservations remain on how it would gel with government reforms, risk distribution, and an EU ban on monetary financing. We need to design a solution in a way that mitigates the concerns of as many people around the table as possible, Executive Board member Benoit Coeur told the Wall Street Journal last week, according to an ECB transcript. No instrument is perfect. Legal judgment. One example of how Draghi can steer policymakers toward a compromise, if not unanimity, is the outright monetary transactions bond buying plan announced in 2012. The Italian managed to limit the number of opponents to just one, Wiedmann, by agreeing to concessions such as the maturities of bonds to be bought and purchasing pauses during reviews. OMT, which has never been used, still came under legal scrutiny. Germany's constitutional court said the ECB overstepped its authority and asked the EU's highest tribunal to decide on its legality. A non-binding opinion will be published on January 14, with a ruling 4 to 6 months later. That may spur policymakers to narrow the liability for national central banks this time, according to Anatoly Anenkov, senior economist at Societe Generale SAR in London. We expect measures to limit credit risk, he said. Options ranged from buying only the highest-rated bonds, to letting national central banks keep the credit risk on their own balance sheets, and/or maintaining senior status in case of a debt restructuring, he said. Reaching out. Other considerations may include limits on purchases relative to each nation's outstanding debt and the size of its economy. Central banks in countries such as Greece and Portugal could be required to set aside extra money or provisions to cover potential losses, Reuters reported on December 19, citing unidentified officials. In a sign Draghi may also be reaching out beyond policymakers. He was due to give a rare interview to Handelsblatt this month. The article has yet to be published. The euro area, which expands to 19 member states when Lithuania joins on January 1, lacks a common, risk-free asset such as the U.S. Treasury's the Federal Reserve Board in its QE program. That leaves the ECB looking at a hodgepodge of covered bonds and asset-backed securities, which it started buying this year, or corporate bonds and government agency debt, which some policymakers have said are possible targets. Should officials decide that size matters in convincing investors though, government bonds offer by far the largest and most liquid debt market. More than 6 trillion euros of sovereign assets are eligible at the ECB as collateral, and so probably for any purchase program. Our base case assumes that Mr. Draghi will implement sovereign QE boldly, said Hua Pil, chief European economist at Goldman Sachs Group Incorporated in London. But we entertain a variant scenario where Mr. Draghi seeks compromise with the QE skeptics. Such a compromise has the potential to disappoint markets. Murder of NYC cops prompts calls for tamping down racial tensions. Bloomberg. The murder of 2 New York City officers ambushed in their car in Brooklyn yesterday by a man claiming retaliation prompted calls to tamp down racial tensions caused by police killings in Staten Island and Missouri. The execution-style shooting of officers Rafael Ramos, 40, and Wenjian Liu, 32, in what Mayor Bill de Blasio called a despicable act, followed online postings in which the alleged killer claimed to be avenging the deaths of Eric Garner, in Staten Island in July, and Michael Brown, in Missouri in August, in incidents with white policemen. This tragic moment may be an opportunity for people to understand each other, said Pastor Michael A. Walrand Jr., of the 8,000-member First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem, in an interview. The pain of a mother whose son lay dead on the ground is the same pain of a 13-year-old boy who lost his police officer father. My hope is that this will shock people into coming together. The officers' murders heightened tension between the de Blasio administration and police unions over the mayor's comments after grand juries made no indictments in the Garner and Brown deaths, and his handling of resulting street protests. At a December 3 news conference, de Blasio cast the discussion in personal terms, saying he and his wife Chirlane, who is black, have spoken with their son, Dante, to be careful dealing with police retaliation unacceptable. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, a 22-year veteran of the NYPD, called all New Yorkers to join him at the scene of the killings tonight for a candlelight vigil in memory of the 2 fallen officers. The Justice League, an offshoot of a social justice organization founded by Calypso singer Harry Belafonte that met with de Blasio last week, will hold a vigil and march tonight in Harlem to remember all victims of violence. It must be perfectly clear that reform can never and must never mean retaliation, Adams said in a statement posted on his Facebook page. Reverend Al Sharpton, a New York civil rights leader, said he and the Garner family are outraged by the officers' murders and that any use of the names of Garner and Brown in defense of the killing of police is reprehensible and against the pursuit of justice. U.S. President Barack Obama denounced the killings and telephoned Police Commissioner William Bratton to offer his full support for any possible assistance, according to a White House statement today. Bloody Hands de Blasio took office in January as the first Democrat to run City Hall in 20 years following a campaign that highlighted economic inequality and policing policies. He vowed to end the city's use of stop-and-frisk tactics that had been challenged as discriminatory in federal court, and reached an agreement with those who sued. A federal appeals court in October blocked police unions from fighting the settlement. Former NYPD Commissioner Ray Kelly said on ABC's This Week that the mayor's statements about protecting his son from police set off what Kelly called a firestorm. Officers turned their backs on de Blasio as he walked into a press conference last night, and Pat Lynch, president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, blamed the mayor for the shootings, saying he has blood on the hands, according to the New York Times. Albert O'Leary, a spokesman for the union, declined to comment on Lynch's remarks in an email, and Robert Mladinich, a spokesman for the Sergeants Benevolent Association, didn't immediately respond to requests for comment on the shootings. Cooler Head's former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, on Fox News Sunday, criticized Lynch's remarks while saying the mayor had allowed protests to get out of control. Former Governor George Pataki tweeted that he was sickened by these barbaric acts, which he called a predictable outcome of divisive anti-cop rhetoric of de Blasio and U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. Kelly said he believes officers will continue to do their jobs despite reports that the union has ordered 2 units to respond to every call. I think cooler heads will prevail, Kelly said on This Week. There was a lot of emotion last night. I think the officers will do their job. I think the commissioner will engage with the union and talk about these specifics. You may see a little of that early on here in terms of additional units going to assignments, but I think that'll quiet down pretty quickly. Instagram post. According to the NYPD, the two officers were sitting in a marked car in the Bedford, Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn at about 2:47 p.m. when the gunman, identified as Ismail Brinsley, 28, walked up to the car's passenger side, took a shooting stance and fired his weapon several times, striking both officers in the head. Police said Brinsley's day started at 5:45 a.m. that morning in Baltimore County, Maryland, where he shot and seriously wounded his former girlfriend, and later made very anti-police postings on social media, including his ex-girlfriend's Instagram account. Baltimore authorities sent a notice to the NYPD and other agencies at about 2:45 p.m., just before Brinsley shot and killed the two officers. The officers never had a chance to draw their weapons and may never have seen Brinsley, Bratton said. Both were taken to Woodhull Hospital, where they were pronounced dead. Brinsley ran south on Tompkins Avenue, pursued by other officers, and then turned westbound on Myrtle Avenue and fled into a subway station at Myrtle Avenue and Willoughby Street, Bratton said. Gunman suicide. Brinsley ran down the stairs onto the westbound subway platform and shot himself in the head, killing himself, Bratton said. A silver semi-automatic Taurus firearm was found on the platform near his body, according to the commissioner. Brinsley had 19 prior arrests in Georgia and Ohio on charges including assault and robbery, and served 2 years in jail, NYPD Chief of Detectives Robert Boyce said at a briefing today. Ramos was a 2-year veteran of the NYPD and was married with a 13-year-old son, while Liu had been with the department 7 years and was recently married. The incident is the 7th time since 1972 that a pair of NYPD officers working together have been killed as partners, according to Bratton. It's sometimes difficult to find the words to speak to events like those that occurred today, to try and make sense of them. But, we'll try, Bratton said. Today, 2 of New York's finest were shot and killed, with no warning, no provocation. They were, quite simply, assassinated, targeted for their uniform, and for the responsibility they embraced, to keep the people of this city safe. Saudi Arabia confident in oil rebounding on global growth. Bloomberg. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, is confident that crude prices will rebound with global economic growth boosting demand. Prices will recover from a slump due to a glut created by a lack of cooperation from producers outside the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Saudi Arabia Oil Minister Ali Al-Naimi said at a conference in Abu Dhabi yesterday. Al-Naimi ended his speech showing the confidence as he jumped off the stage and smiled. Brent oil tumbled into a bear market this year as the U.S. pumped the most oil in more than 3 decades and economic growth slowed from China to Germany. The increase in global crude demand was about 700,000 barrels a day this year, below the projected 1.2 million barrels a day, Al-Naimi said. The oil market will recover, Al-Naimi said. Fossil fuel will remain the main source of energy for decades to come. Oil surged from a 5-year low at the end of last week after Al-Naimi said the slump in prices was temporary. West Texas Intermediate climbed 4.5% to $56.52 a barrel on December 19 and Brent advanced 3.6% to $61.38 a barrel. Saudi Arabia accounted for about 13% of global oil output last year, BP plc estimates. Bullish wages. Money managers are the most bullish since August about the rout being over. The net long position in West Texas Intermediate rose by 26,455 contracts to 217,723 futures and options in the week ended December 16, the most since mid-August, U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission data show. We are now in a provisional, correctional period, Mohammed Al-Sadr, Qatar's energy minister, said at the conference. Markets have stabilization mechanisms that will bring stability. We don't know exactly how long it will take, but it will stabilize because the current prices will separate the efficient producers from the producers who have high costs. Lower oil prices won't have a major effect on Saudi Arabia's economy, Al-Naimi said. Economic growth will expand 4.3% this year and 3.6% next year, according to analyst estimates compiled by Bloomberg. Lack of cooperation from non-OPEC producers and wrong information in the market hit prices, al-Naimi said. Saudi Arabia's oil policy doesn't target other countries, he said. If non-OPEC producers were to offer cuts, OPEC probably wouldn't follow suit, he said. If they want to cut, they are welcome. We're not going to cut. Certainly Saudi Arabia is not going to cut. Technological developments, high prices in the past 3 years and technological developments contributed to increased production, resulting in lower oil prices, al-Naimi said. Brent averaged $100.61 a barrel this year, down from $108.71 in 2013 and $111.68 in 2012. Output in the U.S. is the highest in 3 decades as companies split rocks to produce shale oil. Current prices won't stimulate investment in energy in the long run, al-Naimi said. Less efficient oil producers will be affected by low oil prices, he said. Oil production costs between $5 to $100 a barrel to produce, Qatar's al-Sadr said at the conference. Shale oil costs between $30 to $90 a barrel, al-Naimi said. The rocks in the earth are not homogeneous, they have some sweet spots, where the oil is easier to get out, and sour spots, where it's more difficult. Saudi Arabia has 265 billion barrels of oil reserves, and will increase refining capacity to 3.3 million barrels a day by 2017 from 2.1 million barrels in 2014, al-Naimi said. It's also looking to more joint ventures in downstream projects abroad, he said. The nation wants to become an international hub for climate change and carbon emissions research, he said. Al-Naimi attended United Nations global warming talks in Lima, Peru, this month.